We've been doing a series about the book of Daniel, and I'm just coming back to it again. And we want to draw a few things from the book of Daniel today, from chapter 7. And chapter 7 starts some of Daniel's really, what we might sort of say, weird and wonderful dreams and visions, pretty dramatic. And what's interesting is Daniel chapters 1 to 6 really focused on Daniel and his friends, very much in the context of Daniel's political career and his friends and how they navigate through highly precarious lives, really, in the empires that they serve under. Certainly for Daniel, that is clearly a consistent journey that starts off with the Babylonians and moves into the Medes and Persians. So we get a kind of overview of his political career and the way in which he seeks to walk in integrity. And that's so much today. My prayer is that God would help us, because I think walking through the whole of life with integrity takes different skills at different times. It takes different challenges to be faced at different times. But here we have in Daniel chapter 7 one of these very dramatic visions that Daniel has. I'm just going to read some of Daniel chapter 7 from the beginning. In the first year of Belteshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear, and it was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot what was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch, because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So, before going into more details on the interpretation of the dream and the 4 beasts and so on, which takes quite careful analysis, I have to say, you have to be very careful with Daniel and Revelation to interpret them well. So I'm going to avoid going into that territory straight off. But what's interesting is the interpretation of the dream comes after that and begins to unpack and referring quite a lot to to kingdoms and powers. Very much these beasts are not just animals, as it were, but they're kingdoms, are representing kingdoms. These things are quite troubling for Daniel, and he's a guy who has lived within empires, and he's had a more direct connection with clear dreams coming to perhaps someone like Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel needing to interpret them, and it was highly risky business. So he was in a situation where it wasn't just, oh, well, I've had a nice dream, and what do you think, Daniel? It was kind of like lives are on the line in some of these situations that he was dealing with during his political career. So, it mattered to him to really discern carefully, not just to be flippant. But the thing is, really, what comes across straight away, and what seems pretty much obvious to us as Christians, and those who are people, with a Christian faith, I think it doesn't take too much to conclude that we're talking here about the Ancient of Days. Thrones were set in place. The Ancient of Days took his seat, and his clothing was white as snow. Hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. Well, it's so much the language of Revelation, isn't it? It's so much the language of what we would understand as Christian believers to be talking about a throne in heaven and God's throne and that eternal throne. And it comes into that line of Daniel's previous dream with these different parts of this great statue, these different kingdoms, and then the throne, the rock made not out of human hands, coming and smashing the whole thing to pieces. And I think the important thing that comes out first of all, and pretty clearly, and for us without having to get too much detailed and complex explanation before we even start, is there's a very strong theme that these great powers will be subject to a much higher authority, a much more eternal authority. And these days we're during the time of the pandemic and coronavirus, and it doesn't take too much to go and have a look on social media or YouTube channels and stuff like that. You can find a lot of theories about how the world is going to go, what's going on with world history, what's going on with empires and powers, particularly who's pulling the strings, which key figures are behind it all, and what's going on with China, what's going on with Russia or Turkey, what's going on with different authorities in the world, and these people who seem to exercise enormous amounts of power. And I was mentioning to somebody this afternoon, and they said, oh, what did you think about the book of Daniel at the moment? And I said, well, it's very interesting, isn't it? I feel like we're in a time when it feels like these things are being raised and concerned and discussed again. A time perhaps when lots of challenges might be facing us. I'm really conscious. I literally just looked on the internet, and I'm really aware, for the first time since 1934, the mosque in the centre of Istanbul, which was a museum and had been a Christian church for a long time in Byzantine times, and then was converted to a mosque, and then it became a museum. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has decided it should become an Islamic mosque again, and it's very much a symbol of him perhaps exerting his muscle, his power, perhaps really making a very strong statement about that. We're the Turkish Empire, we're the Turkish power. We have that influence again, and let's make it absolutely clear that Turkey is it's a bridge between Asia and Europe, but it's very much an Islamic state, and he's kind of underlining those points, his influence, his interest. We look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, and we see, its influence was much wider, of course, than Turkey, and then Turkey was quite a key place, in the past, and we see the times perhaps in the past when the Greeks or the Romans had great influence in the Mediterranean, and obviously in the New Testament times in Acts, Turkey, a place of a whole number of churches, but very different situation. Islam hadn't even existed at that point, so very, very different times with the Roman Empire and so on. And so, we're experiencing now this big debate about China and its influence and how much it's had influence in the world over, and Africa, places like that. But its potential to get hold of resources, perhaps to have influence over technology as well. So all these different things, I feel like it's almost like the furniture of empires is shifting a bit. And is that a new thing? Well, not in world history. I've got a book indoors, about the history of the world, and so many different figures and names and times and different periods and reigns and all the rest of it. And of course, all these things come and go and over the centuries. So we're aware that the Bible talks about these things, but it also talks about a much wider context, and that's that above all these is a throne in heaven. Above all these, there's the Ancient of Days. Above all these, there is authority that sits over and above it, and there's also this huge myriad of angels, and this enormous company of heaven. There's this enormous, vast crowd doing God's bidding. And I was looking earlier today at Psalm 103. It talks about you mighty ones who do his bidding. I think we underestimate, we don't have any idea quite what goes on in the spiritual realm. Daniel gets a bit of a glimpse of it. I think God allows him to see something of these huge shifts. It's a bit like, if you can imagine it, when you have thunder and lightning. And when I was a kid, we used to sort of say, oh, that's God moving the furniture upstairs. When someone's reorganising their furniture in their home and you're sitting downstairs and someone's shifting around wardrobes and beds and all sorts of things upstairs. You hear them sort of scraping across the floor and whatever. And thunder and lightning sometimes feels like that, doesn't it? And I think there are times when actually God's moving the chess pieces of empires and so on, and we can feel that we're just tiny pawns. We don't have any power or influence. Here's these little nations sometimes, being pushed around by big empires today. I don't think things have changed all that much in some ways. I don't think the dynamics of it have changed that much. It might be working out in different ways, but the big guys pushing around the small guys, I think that's it's an ongoing story in human history, isn't it? As well as people's personal lives. So that can be happening, but God is bigger, and we see, this God of the universe, the God who defeated not only the kings of Egypt, but the principalities and powers of Egypt, the God who shows himself as the rock, not made of human hands, the kingdom that will eventually topple all other kingdoms, the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne over and above every empire, this God of ours who's sovereign, who's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And we just need to be reminded of that. And I think it comes across very strongly in this dream, even before Daniel gets the interpretation and God begins to unpack the details of what does this mean exactly. There's a very strong message through it. Let's not forget the Ancient of Days is on the throne. He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I pray that be true for our perspective about world history, our perspective about our nation, our perspective about international affairs, our perspective about our own lives, our own small existence, our own little worlds as well, that God is on the throne. I pray that he'll be on the throne of our lives too, in the smallest of details. I sometimes forget to have God on the throne in the small things. I like the big picture things, but I can miss the detail very easily. So I know we all need to see God on the throne in the small moments and in the big things, in the massive things, and to see that he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords in all of the above.